Welcome to our channel. Join us on an epic journey into the heart of West Africa as we uncover Ghana's DNA. We explore the profound legacy of Ashanti gold, a sacred metal that forged an empire, fueled a global trade, and continues to define the soul of a nation. Ghana's DNA, the unbreakable legacy of Ashanti gold. Mythical origins of gold. Before the histories were written, before the empires rose and the traders crossed continents, there was the gold. It was more than a metal. It was a spirit, a divine breath solidified in the very soil of the land that would become Ghana. For the Akan people, gold was not merely discovered. It was a sacred inheritance, a physical manifestation of the sun's power, and a tangible link to the creator god, Niam. Its origins were steeped in a mythology as rich and complex as the veins of quartz that held the precious dust. Deep within the Paleoproterozoic Birimian supergroup rocks, geological forces had spent 2 billion years crushing, heating, and infusing the earth with this treasure, a process of cosmic alchemy that predated humanity itself. But to the early inhabitants, this was Niam's work. Gold was believed to be the earthly counterpart to the sun, radiating a life-giving force, a Kra, or soul that animated the world. This belief was so profound that gold was considered to have regenerative powers. An old, tarnished piece of jewelry was not seen as decaying, but as sleeping, capable of being brought back to vibrant life. This incorruptible nature symbolized spiritual purity and immortality, setting it apart from all other materials found in the earth. The ground itself, Ashanti, the wife of Niam, was the revered earth goddess who yielded this sacred child. Her body was the source of all sustenance, and the gold within it was the most potent piece of her essence. Prospecting and mining were therefore not acts of brute extraction, but sacred dialogues with the earth, governed by rituals and a deep respect for the spirits of the land. Folktales and myths provided a framework for understanding and interacting with this sacred substance. The most famous of these story cycles revolved around Anansi, the trickster spider, who often served as an intermediary between Niam and humanity. While many Anansi tales focus on his cunning and the moral lessons learned from his greed or cleverness, some narratives subtly intertwine with the origins of valuable things. Anansi, in his role as a great designer, or Anansi Kakaroko, was sometimes seen as a creator figure himself, weaving the intricate patterns of life. Stories might tell of how Anansi, through a clever trick or a divine bargain, first brought gold to the people, not as a currency, but as a piece of solidified sunlight to adorn them, to connect them to the divine. One can imagine a tale where Anansi, seeing the people living in a world of green forests and brown earth, desired to give them a color that would remind them of Niam's radiance in the sky. He might have spun a web to the sun itself, carrying back shimmering threads that solidified into the first gold dust as they touched the earth. Such stories, passed down through generations of oral tradition, would have cemented the metal's divine status. It was not a mere commodity. It was a gift, a responsibility, and a source of immense spiritual power. The belief in its supernatural abilities was pervasive. It was thought to provide magical protection to its wearer and to safeguard the spiritual journey of the deceased. This intrinsic link between the spiritual and the material meant that those who worked with gold, the smiths, were themselves figures of immense importance and sacred responsibility, seen as wielding the spark of life through their control of fire. This spiritual understanding of gold profoundly shaped early Akan society. Ownership was not initially about personal wealth in a material sense, but about spiritual prestige and connection to power. Gold was incorporated into the regalia of rulers, not just to signify their earthly dominance, but to represent their purity, vigor, and divine mandate to lead. The dust. The golden stool's significance. The raw economic and military power harnessed by the early Akan states was a potent but volatile force, creating a landscape of competing chiefdoms locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance over trade routes and resources. What was missing was a unifying principle, a gravitational center powerful enough to bind these disparate factions into a single, enduring nation. This void was filled not by a conquering army or a new trade agreement, but by an act of profound spiritual and political genius that would forever define the soul of the Ashanti people. In the late 17th century, amidst the ambitious Ashanti clans, two visionary leaders emerged: Osei Tutu, a skilled warrior and diplomat, and his chief priest and advisor, Okomfo Anakai. They understood that to build a lasting empire, military might and gold dust currency were insufficient. They needed a symbol that transcended earthly wealth, an object so sacred it would command absolute loyalty and forge a new, collective identity. Okomfo Anakai, a figure shrouded in legend and revered for his spiritual prowess, conceived of a radical solution. He summoned the leaders of the independent Ashanti chiefdoms to a great gathering in Kumasi. There, under a sky reputedly darkened by a storm he had conjured, he began to chant incantations, his voice rising with the thunder. Then, as the assembled chiefs watched in awe, a magnificent stool, wrought from a single, solid mass of pure gold, descended from the heavens, slowly coming to rest not on the ground, but gently upon the lap of Osei Tutu. Okomfo Anakai then proclaimed that this object, the Sika Dwa Kofi, the golden stool born on a Friday, was not a mere throne but the embodiment of the Sunsum, the soul, spirit, and unity of the entire Ashanti nation. It was a divine charter, a celestial seal of approval on their nascent empire. The creation of the golden stool was a masterstroke that transformed the very meaning of gold within the Akan worldview. While gold had always been sacred, a tangible piece of the sun's power, the Sika Dwa elevated it to the status of the nation's living heart. Okomfo Anakai decreed a set of inviolable laws surrounding the stool that cemented its supreme authority. First, no person, not even the Asanahin himself, was ever permitted to sit upon it. The stool was the ruler, and the king was merely its chief custodian. It was to be given its own stool to rest upon, its own umbrella of state, and its own retinue of royal attendants. This ensured that the ultimate authority rested not with a fallible human leader, but with the immortal, divine soul of the nation itself. Second, the fate of the stool was inextricably linked to the fate of the Ashanti people. Its health and safety were paramount. If the golden stool were ever to be captured or destroyed, the Sunsum of the Asantman would disintegrate, and the nation would perish, its people scattered and falling into chaos. This belief instilled a fanatical devotion among the Ashanti, making the stool's protection the highest possible duty, a cause for which every man, woman, and child would be willing to die. Through this single brilliant act of political theology, the competing loyalties to individual clans and chiefs were superseded by a greater, sacred allegiance to the golden stool. A new nation, Asantman, was born, not from conquest alone, but from a shared spiritual covenant symbolized by this sacred object. Osei Tutu was now the Asantahin, the king of a unified Ashanti nation, his legitimacy flowing directly from his sacred role as the guardian of the nation's soul. This spiritual unification had immediate and profound political and military consequences. The golden stool became the constitution of the new empire, the ultimate source of all law and authority. The formerly independent chiefs swore binding oaths of allegiance not to Osei Tutu as a man, but to the golden stool, transforming their relationship from that of allies in a loose confederation to integral components of a centralized state. This unity, forged in the divine fire of the stool's origin, allowed the Ashanti to project their power with unprecedented force. The army, now fighting for a sacred, unifying symbol rather than just for the ambitions of a single chief, became the most formidable military machine in the region. The wealth generated from gold mining and trade, which had previously fueled interstate rivalries, was now channeled into strengthening the central state, funding the acquisition of firearms, and financing expansionist campaigns that were framed as sacred duties to protect and honor the golden stool. The stool was present, spiritually if not always physically, in every aspect of state life. It was brought out only on the most sacred and momentous occasions, such as the installment of a new Asanahin, its presence sanctifying the transfer of power. It symbolized the unbroken line of succession and the eternal nature of the Ashanti nation. The golden stool thus represents the absolute zenith of gold's significance in Ghana's history. It is the point where the metal's material value, spiritual power, and political function fused into a single, indivisible concept that created one of Africa's greatest empires. It was no longer just a commodity to be traded or a treasure to be worn, but the very soul of a people, a golden anchor holding them together against the tides of history. Gold and early Akan states. As the mists of mythology began to clear, the tangible power of gold became the bedrock upon which the first centralized Akan states were built, transforming the metal from a purely divine substance into the primary engine of political and economic statecraft. Long before the ascendancy of the Ashanti Empire, precursor states harnessed the immense wealth flowing from the alluvial gold deposits that laced the forest region. The emergence of these polities was a direct consequence of the need to organize, control, and protect the mining and trading of this precious resource. Small, kinship-based communities began to coalesce into larger, more complex chiefdoms and kingdoms, not merely for defense, but to monopolize the lucrative trade routes that connected the forest's treasures with the sprawling markets of the Sahel and beyond. This transition marked a pivotal moment where gold ceased to be just an object of sacred adoration and became the definitive measure of earthly power, the catalyst for social stratification, and the fuel for imperial ambition. The story of these early states, such as Bono and Akwamu, is the story of how a divine gift was methodically forged into the very sinews of a new political order, creating a template of wealth, power, and governance that would define the region for centuries to come. The Bono state, which flourished from as early as the 12th century, stands as the quintessential example of this gold-driven state formation. Often cited as the cradle of Akan civilization, Bono was strategically positioned in the transitional zone between the dense gold-bearing forests to the south and the open savanna to the north, making it a natural crossroads for commerce. Its capital, Bono-Manso, evolved into a bustling urban center, a critical entrepot where gold dust from the Akan fields was exchanged for salt, textiles, copper, and other goods brought by Mande-speaking dialect traders from great commercial hubs like Jen and Timbuktu. The wealth generated was staggering, and the rulers of Bono channeled it with remarkable sophistication. Gold dust became the principal currency, its value meticulously measured using an intricate system of brass weights, or mramuo. This monetization of gold standardized transactions and allowed for the accumulation of unprecedented state capital, which was stored in the royal treasury. This wealth funded a standing army, supported a complex court bureaucracy, and financed the creation of dazzling regalia that visually reinforced the king's authority. The Bono state, therefore, provides the earliest clear evidence of a centralized Akan kingdom whose political structure, economic prosperity, and cultural identity were inextricably linked to the systematic exploitation and trade of gold. It was here that gold was first institutionalized as the foundation of the state, a model of resource-based power that would be emulated and ultimately perfected by its successors. Further south and later in time, the rise of the Akwamu Empire in the 17th century demonstrated a more militaristic and expansionist application of gold-fueled power. Emerging from the Adwana clan, the Akwamu were initially an inland power, but their ambition was sharpened by the desire to control the increasingly profitable trade routes leading directly to the European forts established along the coast. While the Bono state's wealth was built on the north-facing trans-Saharan trade, Akwamu recognized that a new nexus of power was forming on the Atlantic shore. Hemmed in by rival states, the Akwamu Hinansa Sisraku launched a series of brilliant military campaigns between 1677 and 1681, conquering the Giadengbi people and capturing the strategic coastal trading centers, including the site of modern-day Accra. This audacious expansion, financed by gold revenues, gave Akwamu direct control over the flow of gold to the European traders, allowing them to cut out intermediaries and dictate terms. Their empire, at its zenith, stretched for over 250 miles along the coast, a testament to their military prowess and economic acumen. The Akwamu rulers, like their Bono predecessors, understood that gold was more than just a commodity. It was the ultimate tool of statecraft. They used their vast wealth to purchase firearms from the Europeans, creating a formidable army that sustained their imperial dominance. Gold was used to secure alliances, pay tribute, and reward loyal warriors, binding the disparate parts of their conquered territories to a central authority whose power was visibly expressed through lavish displays of golden regalia. The Akwamu's aggressive expansion and their strategic shift towards controlling coastal trade represented a crucial evolution in the political economy of the region, demonstrating how gold wealth could be leveraged not just for commercial prosperity, but for outright military conquest and the building of a coastal empire. These early Akan states, founded and financed by the sacred metal, were the crucibles in which the political DNA of the future Ghana was forged. They established the foundational principles that control over gold meant control over trade, that control over trade translated into military strength, and that military strength was the key to political preeminence. They created complex systems of currency, taxation, and administration centered on gold, laying the institutional groundwork upon which the great Ashanti Empire would later rise to unprecedented heights of power and influence. Trans-Saharan gold trade. Long before the first European sails appeared as specks on the Atlantic horizon, the gold of the Akan forests was already a legendary force in the global economy, the shimmering prize at the end of one of the most arduous and ancient trade routes known to humanity, the Trans-Saharan Caravan Network. This vast web of pathways, stretching like arteries across the sea of sand, connected the West African interior to the bustling markets of North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the wider Islamic world. For centuries, the Akan region, known to Arab geographers as the fabled land of Wangara, was the primary source for the gold that fueled the economies of medieval empires and financed the cultural flourishing of civilizations thousands of miles away. This trade was not a simple exchange of goods, but a complex, multi-layered enterprise built on intricate relationships, immense logistical challenges, and the unquenchable global thirst for the precious metal. It was through this northern-facing trade that Akan gold first stepped onto the world stage, transforming the perception of West Africa from a remote, unknown territory into a near-mythical source of inexhaustible wealth. The engine of this trade was a sophisticated chain of intermediaries. At its source were the Akan miners, who extracted gold dust and nuggets from the riverbeds and shallow pits of the forest zone using methods passed down through generations. This treasure was then brought to the fringes of the forest, where it was met by the Mande-speaking Diala traders, a class of itinerant merchants renowned for their commercial acumen and extensive networks. The Diala were the crucial link, consolidating the gold and transporting it northward to sprawling market cities like Jen and Timbuktu, which stood on the southern edge of the Sahara. It was in these cosmopolitan centers that the gold began its transcontinental journey. Packed into small leather pouches and loaded onto vast camel caravans, the precious cargo was entrusted to Berber and Tuareg nomads, the undisputed masters of the desert, who navigated by the stars across the desolate landscape, braving sandstorms, extreme temperatures, and the constant threat of raids. After a perilous journey that could last for months, the caravans would arrive in the great commercial hubs of the Maghreb, such as Sijil Massa in Morocco, where the gold would finally enter the markets of Europe and the Middle East. The value of this trade was predicated on a fundamental geographic imbalance. The forest had gold but lacked salt, an essential mineral for human and animal life that was mined in vast quantities from desert sites like Tagaza. This simple, symbiotic need formed the backbone of the Trans-Saharan exchange. Salt slabs, carried south by the same caravans that took gold north, were so valuable that they were often said to be traded for their literal weight in gold. But the trade was far more diverse than a simple exchange of gold for salt. In return for their precious metal, the Akan states receive a dazzling array of luxury goods that enhance the power and prestige of their rulers. From North Africa came fine textiles, including silks and velvets, which were incorporated into the magnificent Kent cloth designs. From the workshops of the Islamic world came intricate brassware, glassware, and colorful beads. Horses, which could not survive long in the tsetse fly-infested forest, but were vital symbols of status and military power for savanna chiefs, were also a key import. Crucially, the trade also brought ideas. While the Akan largely retained their traditional belief systems, the presence of Muslim traders introduced Islamic concepts of law, literacy, and administration, which subtly influenced the increasingly complex Akan courts. This constant flow of goods and ideas, managed and taxed by the Akan rulers, supercharged the process of state formation. The wealth accumulated in the royal treasuries, measured with ever more sophisticated brass gold weights, mramuel, funded the expansion of armies, the construction of palaces, and the maintenance of lavish courts, creating a cycle where control of the gold trade directly translated into greater political and military power. The city of Bonomanso became a vibrant testament to this era, a thriving metropolis where the cultures of the forest, the savanna, and the desert converged, all drawn by the magnetic pull of gold. The impact of this trade resonated far beyond the borders of West Africa, fundamentally shaping the economic destiny of medieval Europe and the Middle East. The legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 by Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, whose empire controlled the northern termini of the trade routes, provides the most dramatic illustration of this. His entourage carried so much Akan gold that when he passed through Cairo, his lavish spending and generous gifts depressed the local price of gold for over a decade, sending economic ripples throughout the Mediterranean. This single event cemented the image of West Africa as an El Dorado in the European imagination. The gold that crossed the Sahara was minted into florins in Florence and ducats in Venice, financing the Italian Renaissance. It paid for the wars of North African sultans and adorned the mosques of the Middle East. For centuries, the Akan gold fields were, in effect, the central bank for much of the known world, a fact unknown to the European cartographers who could only draw Wang era on their maps as a vague, undefined region of immense wealth. This long and prosperous era of the trans-Saharan trade established the fundamental economic and political importance of gold for the Akan states. It created sophisticated systems of commerce, fostered the growth of urban centers, and connected the forest region to global networks of exchange long before the arrival of Europeans. It was this pre-existing, highly organized, and immensely profitable gold economy that the Portuguese would encounter when they finally sailed down the coast, seeking to bypass the desert caravans and tap directly into the source of the world's most coveted metal. The stage was set for a dramatic shift in the direction of trade, from the ancient sands of the Sahara to the new highways of the Atlantic Ocean. Europeans and coastal gold trade. The ancient, dusty caravan trails that had for centuries funneled Akan gold northward across the Sahara were about to be rendered obsolete by a new and revolutionary highway of commerce, the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. In 1471, the arrival of Portuguese caravels, captained by explorers like Diogo de Azambuja, marked a cataclysmic shift in the history of the region, a moment when the world, quite literally, turned upside down. Lured by the same centuries-old rumors of West African riches that had sustained the Saharan trade, these European mariners sought to outflank their Venetian and Ottoman rivals by bypassing the North African middlemen and sailing directly to the source of the fabled gold of Wang era. For the coastal Akan chiefs who first witnessed these strange, masted ships emerging from the horizon, it was an encounter pregnant with both unprecedented opportunity and unimaginable peril. This new maritime connection did not just open another trade route, it fundamentally reoriented the entire economic and political geography of the region, pivoting the flow of wealth 180 degrees from the northern deserts to the southern coast and initiating a new era of intense commercial rivalry, technological transformation, and escalating conflict. The Portuguese understood that to secure their access to this immense wealth, they needed more than just ships, they needed a permanent foothold. In 1482, with the negotiated consent of the local chief Kwamina Ansa, they constructed a formidable stone fortress they named São Jorge de Mina, or St. George of Mine, today known as Elmina Castle. This was not a beachhead for territorial conquest of the interior, but a fortified trading factory, a secure warehouse where European goods could be stored and gold could be safely collected. It was the first of many such European forts that would eventually stud the coastline, built by the Dutch, English, Danes, Swedes, and Brandenburgers, all vying for a share of the lucrative trade. This chain of castles turned the shoreline into a new, powerful frontier, a porous membrane through which gold flowed out, and a torrent of new goods, ideas, and most consequentially, technologies flowed in. The nature of the exchange itself evolved rapidly, setting in motion a powerful and transformative arms race. Initially, the Akan were interested in European goods such as brass and copper vessels, brightly colored textiles, and alcohol, items that conferred status and could be incorporated into courtly life and regalia. However, one commodity soon eclipsed all others in demand: firearms. Muskets, gunpowder, and lead shot represented a revolutionary leap in military technology for the region. Akan states quickly realized that the chief who controlled the trade in firearms gained an overwhelming advantage over his rivals. The ability to field soldiers armed with muskets could mean the difference between survival and annihilation, between being a vassal state and a regional superpower. This insatiable demand for weaponry fundamentally altered the motivations for trade and warfare. Gold was no longer sought merely for wealth and prestige in the traditional sense. It was now the essential currency for acquiring the tools of empire building and destruction. A vicious cycle was initiated. A state needed gold to buy guns, and it needed guns to conquer more territory and control more trade routes, which in turn provided more gold to buy more guns. This dynamic dramatically accelerated the process of political centralization and militarization, favoring aggressive, expansionist states like Akwamu, and most significantly, the nascent Ashanti Confederacy, which astutely positioned itself to dominate the trade routes from the interior gold fields to the coastal forts. The Europeans, for their part, were more than willing to supply this demand, a kilogram of gold fetching hundreds of muskets, creating immense profits, and ensuring a steady flow of the precious metal back to the treasuries and mints of Europe. This intense, gold-focused commerce cemented the region's identity in the European mind, leading them to christen it, with stark literalness, the Gold Coast. This name, which would persist for nearly 500 years, reflected the coast's singular importance as the premier source of gold for the European world throughout the early modern period. The economic and social consequences for Akan society were profound. The coastal trade created new centers of power and new classes of wealthy merchant intermediaries who brokered deals between the inland producers and the European garrisons. It further entrenched the power of paramount chiefs who could monopolize the trade within their territories, using the wealth to expand their bureaucracies, their military forces, and the dazzling spectacle of their golden gilded courts. The trans-Saharan trade, while not extinguished overnight, began a slow and irreversible decline in importance for the forest kingdoms, whose gaze was now fixed southward on the fortified castles and the gun-laden ships they attracted. The gold that had once financed the Renaissance in Italy was now being used to purchase the very weapons that would empower the rise of the Ashanti Empire, an indigenous power that would soon grow strong enough to challenge not only its African rivals, but the European enclaves on the coast as well. The DNA of the nation was being resequenced, with the ancient strands of myth and Saharan commerce now spliced with the volatile new elements of Atlantic trade, gunpowder, and globalizing capital. Ashanti goldsmiths and craftsmanship. The immense river of gold flowing into the coffers of the burgeoning Ashanti Empire was not merely hoarded as inert wealth. It was transformed with breathtaking skill and profound spiritual reverence into a dazzling visual language that proclaimed the power, history, and philosophy of the nation. At the heart of this transformation were the royal goldsmiths, the Sika Adwumfu, who were far more than simple artisans. They were revered as masters of a sacred craft, custodians of esoteric knowledge, and essential figures within the intricate political and spiritual structure of the state. Working primarily under the direct patronage of the Ashanti and his paramount chiefs, these smiths were organized into hereditary guilds, their jealously guarded skills passed down from father to son, uncle to nephew, through long and arduous apprenticeships. Their workshops, clustered in specific quarters of Kumasi, were not just places of manufacture but liminal spaces where the raw, sacred power of gold, the earthly embodiment of the sun, and the sole force of the nation, was respectfully shaped and imbued with meaning. The master goldsmith was a figure of immense prestige, a confidant of kings, and a living repository of cultural knowledge, for his task was not merely to create beautiful objects, but to cast the very identity of the Asantman in incorruptible, shimmering metal. His hands, skilled in the alchemy of fire and metal, were responsible for translating the abstract concepts of power, lineage, and wisdom into the tangible regalia that defined the empire in the eyes of its people and its rivals. The primary technique that enabled their extraordinary creativity was the sophisticated serré perdu, or lost wax casting method, a process that allowed for the creation of intricate, three-dimensional objects of unparalleled detail. The process began with the careful sculpting of a precise model of the desired object in beeswax, a malleable medium that permitted the artist to capture the finest nuances of form and texture. This wax model was then painstakingly encased in multiple layers of fine clay, forming a dense, heat-resistant mold. Once dried, the entire assembly was fired in a charcoal furnace. The intense heat hardened the clay into a ceramic shell, while simultaneously melting the beeswax, which would run out through specially designed channels, leaving a perfect, hollow negative impression of the original sculpture inside, the lost wax. At this critical juncture, the molten gold, heated to a liquid brilliance in a crucible, was poured into the empty mold, filling every tiny crevice of the void left by the wax. After the metal had cooled and solidified, the clay mold was carefully broken away, destroying it in the process, but revealing the unique, one-of-a-kind golden object within. This method meant that no two lost wax castings were ever exactly identical, lending an inherent preciousness and individuality to each piece. The raw casting was then subjected to meticulous finishing, filing, burnishing, and polishing, to bring out the metal's lustrous glow. This technique was supplemented by other skills such as repoussé, where designs were hammered into thin gold sheets from the reverse side, and gilding, where gossamer-thin layers of gold leaf were applied to wooden objects like the Ashanti sandals or the hilts of ceremonial swords, transforming them into symbols of sacred authority. What truly elevated Ashanti craftsmanship beyond mere technical virtuosity was its deep symbolic grammar. Every piece of gold work was a text, dense with meaning, intended to be read and understood. The artisans created a vast lexicon of visual motifs, many of which were representations of Akan proverbs, communicating complex philosophical and ethical ideas with elegant conciseness. A small golden Sankofa bird, with its head turned backward to retrieve an egg from its back, was an instantly recognizable reminder of the proverb, "Say wor fi na wo zankafa a yen chi." It is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind, a powerful statement on the importance of learning from the past. The iconic porcupine, or katoko, was the symbol of the Ashanti nation itself, evoking the proverb, "Wokum apum apum biba," if you kill 1,000, 1,000 will come, a defiant expression of their military resilience. These proverbial and symbolic designs adorned every conceivable object of state. They were cast into the finials of linguist staffs, Okiami Poma, allowing the king's spokesman to literally hold the embodiment of the wisdom he was about to articulate. They were worked into the massive pectoral discs worn by court officials, the intricate designs on the state swords Afina, and the patterns on the king's sandals. This visual language extended to the famous gold weights, the mramuo. While ostensibly functional tools for weighing gold dust, These miniature brass sculptures became a canvas for depicting every facet of Akan life, from scenes of farming and drumming to representations of mythical beasts and complex geometric patterns, creating a veritable library in metal of the society's values, history, and worldview. This art form was therefore a critical tool of governance and social cohesion, constantly reinforcing the core principles of the Ashanti state and the legitimacy of its rulers, transforming the spectacle of the royal court into a dynamic and powerful public lesson in history, politics, and ethics. The Anglo-Ashanti Wars. The delicate, often tense, but mutually profitable trading relationship established on the coast could not endure forever, as it was a precarious balance between two expanding empires with fundamentally irreconcilable ambitions. The Ashanti, whose gold-fueled power had created an inland empire that viewed direct control of the coastline as its manifest destiny, and the British, whose industrial-era capitalist hunger was giving way to a more aggressive, territorial imperialism that sought to control not just the trade, but the very source of the wealth. The 19th century thus became the stage for a century-long, brutal collision, a series of 5 major conflicts known as the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, in which the dazzling gold of the empire became both the primary cause of the fighting and the ultimate prize for the victor. The friction was constant, erupting over control of vassal states, disputes over the Fani people who acted as coastal middlemen, and the British abolition of the slave trade, which had become an integral, if dark, component of the coastal economy. For the Ashanti, British forts and their alliances with coastal peoples were an intolerable barrier to their economic and political sovereignty. For the British, the powerful, highly organized Ashanti kingdom was a constant threat to their commercial interests and a defiant obstacle to their civilizing mission. The inevitable escalation came in 1874 during the Second Anglo-Ashanti War, when a formidable British expeditionary force under the command of Sir Garnet Wolseley marched on Kumasi with the explicit aim of breaking the empire's power once and for all. Armed with superior weaponry, including artillery and early machine guns, they fought their way through the dense forest and captured the capital. What they found there astonished them. A city of remarkable order and a royal palace, the Aban, filled with treasures that testified to the immense wealth of the state. In a calculated act of profound psychological warfare and imperial punishment, Wolseley ordered Kumasi to be systematically looted and then destroyed with explosives. British soldiers ransacked the palace, seizing priceless gold regalia, intricate jewelry, ceremonial weapons, and countless artifacts, many of which were the masterworks of the royal goldsmiths described in generations past. This was not mere plunder, it was the deliberate tearing apart of the nation's historical and spiritual identity, cast in gold. The looted treasures were shipped to London, with many items ending up in museums like the British Museum and the Wallace Collection, while others were auctioned off to pay for the military campaign. To add to the humiliation, the British imposed the Treaty of Fomena, which demanded a massive war indemnity of 50,000 ounces of gold, further draining the state's treasury and asserting British economic dominance. Despite this devastating blow, the soul of the nation, the Sika Dwa Kofi, remained hidden and safe, and as long as it did, the assentment could not be truly conquered. The British, however, fundamentally failed to grasp the stool's sacred significance, viewing it merely as a king's throne, a symbol of authority that, if captured, would collapse the empire. This catastrophic misunderstanding set the stage for the final, most famous confrontation, the War of the Golden Stool in 1900. The newly appointed British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, traveled to Kumasi and, in an act of supreme arrogance and cultural ignorance, convened a meeting of the Ashanti chiefs who had been brought back under a British protectorate. In a speech that would ignite the flames of rebellion, he demanded that they surrender the Golden Stool so that he, as the representative of Queen Victoria, could sit upon it. To the assembled chiefs, this was not a political demand but an act of unthinkable sacrilege, a call to commit national suicide by surrendering their collective soul to a foreigner to be desecrated. The demand was met with stunned silence, which quickly hardened into furious defiance. With most of the male leadership exiled by the British, it was a woman, the Queen Mother of the Ejisu Dominion, Ashanti, who rallied the nation. In a fiery speech that has become legendary in Ghanaian history, she shamed the wavering chiefs, declaring that if the men would not fight to defend their sacred honor, the women would rise up and do so. Her words galvanized the people into one final, desperate war of resistance. The ensuing conflict was a brutal siege. Ashanti led the Ashanti forces, who surrounded the British fort in Kumasi, trapping Hodgson and his contingent for months in a grueling standoff marked by fierce fighting and starvation. The British eventually sent a massive relief column to break the siege and crush the rebellion. Ashanti and other leaders were captured and exiled to the Seychelles, and in 1902, the British formally annexed the Ashanti territory into the Gold Coast colony. Yet, in the most crucial sense, the Ashanti won their ultimate victory. The British, despite their military triumph and the immense resources they poured into the search, never found the golden stool. It had been successfully hidden by its devout guardians, who moved it from one secret location to another, protecting the nation's Sunsum from capture. The war, born from a British desire to possess the ultimate symbol of Ashanti gold, ended with that symbol remaining defiantly beyond their reach. The conflict cemented the stool's place as the unshakable core of Ashanti identity, a symbol not just of unity and power, but now of resistance, sacrifice, and survival against the overwhelming force of a global empire. The wars represented the violent appropriation of Ashanti gold wealth by a colonial power, but the failure to capture the golden stool ensured that the spiritual legacy of that gold, the very soul of a nation, remained unconquered, a potent seed of identity that would endure through the colonial era and blossom once more in the struggle for independence. The battlefield had shifted from trade disputes to a total war over the nation's very essence, an essence that proved to be as incorruptible and enduring as the sacred metal from which its central symbol was made. Colonial gold extraction. With the smoke of the final war cleared and the defiant Ashanti leadership exiled, the nature of the quest for gold underwent a radical and definitive transformation. The era of negotiation, trade, and even armed conflict between sovereign powers was over, replaced by the cold, systematic, and insatiable logic of colonial industrial capitalism. The British Crown, having secured absolute political control through conquest, now moved to assert absolute economic control over the very earth of the Gold Coast. The prize was no longer just the gold that could be traded for, but the vast, untapped subterranean reserves that had sourced the wealth of empires for a millennium. This new phase was not driven by warriors and diplomats, but by geologists, engineers, and financiers from London, who saw the land not as the sacred body of the Earth Mother, Acacia, but as a geological asset, a map of concessions to be claimed and exploited. The focus shifted from the king's court to the corporation's boardroom. In 1897, even before the final war, a company named the Ashanti Goldfields Corporation, AGC, was formed, acquiring a massive 100-square-mile concession around the town of Obwesai. This single act was the blueprint for the future. The colonial administration enacted new ordinances on land and concessions that effectively transferred mineral rights from indigenous stewardship to European corporate ownership, often in exchange for trivial annual payments to local chiefs who had little choice in the matter. The intricate Akan systems of land tenure and the sacred prescriptions against deep mining were swept aside by the stroke of a colonial pen, replaced by legally binding contracts that signed away the wealth of generations for the benefit of distant, anonymous shareholders. The methods of extraction were as revolutionary as the legal framework that enabled them. The traditional Akan techniques of alluvial panning in rivers and the painstaking digging of shallow pits, which had sustained the gold economy for centuries, were dismissed as inefficient and primitive. In their place came the full might of the Industrial Revolution. Steam-powered engines, pumps, and head frames were shipped from Britain and hauled through the dense forest to sites like Obwesai, Tarkwa, and Presti, creating jarring industrial landscapes in the heart of the rainforest. Engineers sank deep, vertical shafts thousands of feet into the earth, chasing the quartz reefs of the Birimian rock formations. Dynamite, a force of unprecedented power, was used to blast a rock underground, which was then hauled to the surface, crushed to powder by massive stamp mills whose thunderous noise echoed for miles, and then subjected to the new chemical process of cyanide leaching to extract microscopic particles of gold. This was mining on a scale previously unimaginable, a brutal, efficient, and relentless assault on the deep geology of the land. To service this new industrial machine, a new kind of infrastructure was required, one designed not for the benefit of the local population, but for the sole purpose of extraction. A railway line was constructed, a steel artery connecting the inland mining centers directly to the newly built deep-water port of Takoradi on the coast, allowing heavy machinery to be brought in and the processed gold bullion to be shipped out with maximum efficiency. This railway was a physical manifestation of the colonial economic model, a one-way conveyor belt carrying the raw wealth of the colony away to enrich the metropole. This industrial revolution created a profound social upheaval, fundamentally reordering the lives of the Akan people. The mines required a huge, constant supply of cheap labor, giving rise to a new social class, the wage-earning mine worker. Tens of thousands of men from across the Gold Coast and neighboring territories were drawn to the mining towns, leaving behind their farms, families, and traditional social structures. They were housed in crowded, often unsanitary compounds and subjected to a rigid industrial discipline utterly alien to their previous ways of life. They descended into the dangerous darkness of the deep shafts, facing the constant risks of rock falls, explosions, and lung disease for wages that were a mere fraction of the value they produced. This mass migration and proletarianization shattered old social bonds and created new, often volatile, urban communities around the mines. While the Ashanti Empire had used gold to build a powerful, self-sustaining state and a rich cultural life, the colonial system ensured that the vast majority of the wealth generated by this new, more intensive extraction flowed directly out of the country. The Ashanti Goldfields Corporation, for instance, became one of the most profitable and consistently high-yielding gold mines in the entire British Empire, its dividends enriching investors in London, while the Gold Coast itself saw only a sliver of the profits in the form of meager royalties and taxes. The sacred metal, the sunsum of a nation, had been reduced to a mere commodity on the London Stock Exchange, its extraction fueling the expansion of another empire, an empire that had conquered it not just with guns, but with contracts, machines, and the unyielding logic of the balance sheet. Financing independence with gold. The vast industrial machine of colonial mining, designed for the singular purpose of siphoning wealth from the Gold Coast to Great Britain, inadvertently produced the very forces that would dismantle it within the deep, sweltering shafts of Obwesai and the noisy, regimented compounds of Tarkwa. A new consciousness was being forged, one that saw the river of gold flowing out of the country not as a dividend for distant shareholders, but as a stolen birthright. The fight for independence was, at its core, a struggle for economic sovereignty, and gold became its most potent symbol and, ultimately, its most critical financial instrument. The nationalist movement, which gained unstoppable momentum after World War II, was fueled by this palpable sense of economic injustice. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party, CPP, build a powerful political narrative by contrasting the immense mineral wealth being extracted from a nation's soil with the poverty and lack of development experienced by its people. The colonial era name itself, the Gold Coast, once a badge of honor, was now wielded as an indictment, a constant reminder that the people of the land had been reduced to mere custodians of a treasure house being systematically emptied by foreigners. The promise of independence was therefore not just a promise of political freedom, but a promise to seize control of the levers of the economy, to turn the flow of gold inward, and to use the nation's own resources to build the nation itself. This message resonated powerfully from the intellectuals in Accra to the farmers in the Cocoa Belt, but found its most militant expression among the very men whose labor generated the wealth, the mine workers. The industrialization of mining had created a large, concentrated, and organized working class, and their nascent trade unions became crucibles of political activism. The Great Mine Workers' Strike of 1947 was a watershed moment. Though ostensibly about wages and working conditions, it was a direct challenge to the authority of the colonial corporations and, by extension, the colonial state. These labor actions, often brutally suppressed, demonstrated that the economic engine of the colony could be disrupted and contested, feeding directly into the broader political struggle and hardening the resolve of the nationalist cause. Upon achieving independence on March 6, 1957, Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah made a profoundly symbolic choice. He renamed the country Ghana after the great ancient West African Empire that had also drawn its power and fame from the gold trade, immediately reconnecting the new nation with its pre-colonial legacy of strength and sovereignty. This was more than just a name change. It was a declaration of intent. The new government moved swiftly to translate this symbolic reclamation into economic reality. While not undertaking outright nationalization immediately, Nkrumah's government took measures to gain a greater share of the mineral wealth. It established the Ghana State Mining Corporation, GSMC, and began acquiring majority stakes in the major European-owned mining companies, including the iconic Ashanti Goldfields Corporation. This was a pivotal reversal. For the first time, a significant portion of the profits generated from the mines would flow into the national treasury rather than exclusively to London. Gold, alongside cocoa, became the financial bedrock upon which Nkrumah's ambitious vision for a modern, industrialized Ghana was to be built. The revenues were not just figures in a ledger. They were the fuel for a radical transformation of the country's landscape and society. The gold that had once paid for British military campaigns was now earmarked to fund the construction of the Akosombo Dam, a monumental project designed to provide hydroelectric power for an industrialized future. The bullion shipped from Takoradi now financed the development of Tema Harbor into a world-class port, the establishment of the University of Ghana, the building of countless schools and hospitals, and the creation of a national airline. It was a moment of profound historical justice, where the legacy of Ashanti gold was being actively and consciously repurposed to build a post-colonial African utopia. This assertion of economic independence was also broadcast to the world through the creation of a new national currency, the Ghanaian pound, later replaced by the cedi in 1965, which was backed by the country's reserves of gold and cocoa. This act of minting its own currency, adorned with national symbols, was a crucial step in delinking Ghana's economy from its colonial past and asserting its status as a sovereign player on the world stage. The Bank of Ghana's vaults, now storing Ghanaian-owned gold bullion, became the ultimate symbol of this newfound economic self-determination. Nkrumah, a leading voice in the Pan-African movement, saw Ghana's success as a blueprint for the entire continent. He believed that by harnessing their own natural resources, African nations could break the chains of neo-colonial dependency and chart their own course. Ghana's gold was therefore not just for Ghana. It was a symbol of hope and a source of practical support for liberation movements across Africa. In this brief, optimistic dawn of independence, the historical significance of gold reached a new zenith. It had transcended its roles as a sacred substance, an imperial treasure, and a colonial commodity. It had become the lifeblood of national liberation, the primary capital for post-colonial development, and the shimmering emblem of a Pan-African dream. The DNA of the nation was being consciously rewritten, using the ancient, incorruptible code of gold to script a bold new future of freedom and self-reliance. Post-colonial state mining. The triumphant optimism of independence, which had seen the nation's gold reserves as the inexhaustible fuel for building a modern African utopia, soon collided with the harsh realities of post-colonial governance and the unforgiving dynamics of the global economy, ushering in a long, painful era of decline for the state-controlled mining sector. The dream of a nationally owned industry serving the people began to corrode almost as soon as it was born. The 1966 coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah was a political earthquake, and its aftershocks destabilized the nation for decades, creating a volatile environment of revolving-door military juntas and short-lived civilian governments. This chronic political instability was poison to the long-term, capital-intensive business of deep-shaft mining. The State Gold Mining Corporation, SGMC, which had taken control of the major mines at Tarkwa, Presti, and Dunkwa, became a microcosm of the nation's broader struggles. Instead of being run as an efficient commercial enterprise, it was increasingly treated as a political tool, a source of patronage for whichever regime was in power. Management positions were often filled based on political loyalty rather than technical expertise, leading to a crippling breakdown in operational strategy and day-to-day administration. The corporation became bloated with an oversized, unproductive workforce, a consequence of populist policies aimed at creating employment at any cost. This bureaucratic inertia and political interference severed the vital link between production and profit, transforming the mines from the nation's primary economic engine into a sputtering, inefficient, and increasingly costly liability that began to drain, rather than fill, the national treasury. This institutional decay was mirrored by a steady and catastrophic physical decay within the mines themselves. The vast underground networks, the deep shafts, and the sophisticated processing plants inherited from a colonial era required constant, massive capital reinvestment to remain safe and productive. But with the country lurching from one economic crisis to another, and with profits from the mines dwindling, foreign exchange for new machinery and spare parts became almost impossible to secure. The once mighty head frames that hoisted men and ore from the earth's depths began to rust and seize. The railway lines that carried the ore fell into disrepair. Underground, the ventilation and water pumping systems, crucial for life and safety, became unreliable. The technology, once at the cutting edge of the British Empire, was now decades out of date, making Ghanaian mines increasingly uncompetitive on the world market. Production, which had peaked in the early 1960s, entered a precipitous decline. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the official output of Ghanaian gold had plummeted to a fraction of its former glory, a shocking collapse for a nation whose very identity was synonymous with the metal. This technical decline was exacerbated by external economic shocks. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, which decoupled the US dollar from gold, sent the price of the metal on a volatile roller coaster, and prolonged periods of low prices made the high-cost, low-efficiency state mines utterly unprofitable. Combined with the oil crises of the 1970s, which sent energy costs soaring, the SGMC found itself trapped in a perfect storm of rising expenses and falling revenues, pushing it to the brink of total collapse. The human cost of this slow-motion industrial failure was immense and devastating. The proud mining towns that had once been bustling centers of the colonial economy became hollowed-out shells of their former selves. The social infrastructure, the hospitals, schools, and social clubs originally built by the colonial corporations, crumbled from neglect. Mass layoffs became common as the SGMC struggled to stay afloat, throwing tens of thousands of miners out of work and erasing the primary source of income for entire communities. A deep sense of disillusionment set in. The promise of independence, the dream that the nation's own people would now benefit from their own wealth, had curdled into a bitter reality of decay, poverty, and hopelessness. For the men who had once descended into the earth each day with the pride of building a new nation, the silent, rusting machinery and the locked gates of the mines were a constant, painful testament to a grand vision that had failed. This widespread economic desperation, however, did not extinguish the centuries-old relationship between the people and the gold in their land. Instead, it drove it back underground, away from the collapsing formal state sector and into the shadows. As the great industrial mines ground to a halt, a new, informal, and unregulated gold rush was about to begin, driven not by corporations or the state, but by the desperate, resilient, and resourceful individuals who would come to be known as the Galamsey. The failure of the post-colonial state's stewardship of its most precious resource had inadvertently set the stage for a chaotic and environmentally perilous new chapter in Ghana's long and complex story with gold. The Galamsey Challenge. As the great state-owned mines rusted into monuments of a failed national dream, the ancient, intimate bond between the people and the gold beneath their feet did not break. It atomized, fracturing into a million desperate individual struggles for survival that would collectively scar the nation in ways the colonialists never could. This was the dawn of the Galamsey era, a phenomenon whose name, a pidgin corruption of the English phrase, gather them and sell, perfectly captured its raw, subsistence-level origins. It began as a whisper in the impoverished former mining towns, a return to the old ways of panning in riverbeds and digging shallow pits, a pursuit of last resort for the tens of thousands of laid-off miners and unemployed youth who were left with nothing but the land itself. But this was not a revival of the sacred, ritual-bound practices of their ancestors who respectfully asked the Earth Mother for her bounty. This was a frantic, unregulated scramble, an anarchic gold rush driven by the brutal logic of poverty. It was the darkened version of the Ashanti Legacy, where gold once built an empire and unified a people. Its pursuit now threatened to poison the nation's rivers, tear apart its social fabric, and pit citizen against state in a chaotic, unwinnable conflict. The methods were often primitive and lethally dangerous. Young men, armed with little more than shovels, pickaxes, and a desperate courage, would descend into narrow, unbraced pits, burrowing deep into the earth, chasing rumors of a rich vein. Tunnel collapses were terrifyingly common, burying miners alive in the very ground they hoped would be their salvation. Others worked in the riverbeds, standing for hours in murky water, washing gravel through wooden sluice boxes in the hope of seeing the telltale glint of color. The most perilous aspect, however, was the processing. To separate the fine gold dust from the ore, the Galamsey miners used mercury, a toxic heavy metal that they would mix with the sediment by hand, often with their bare skin. The resulting amalgam would then be heated over an open flame, vaporizing the mercury into a poisonous cloud that they inhaled directly, leaving behind a small, porous lump of gold. This process, repeated thousands of times a day along every major river in the Gold Belt, unleashed a slow-moving environmental catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The challenge exploded from a localized subsistence activity into a full-blown national crisis with the arrival of new players and new technology. In the 2000s, an influx of foreign nationals, particularly from China, partnered with local Ghanaians to introduce heavy machinery into the informal sector, fundamentally changing the game. Suddenly, the single-man pit and the handheld pan were dwarfed by the roar of diesel engines. Excavators and bulldozers, operating with impunity deep within the forest reserves, began to tear up the land on an industrial scale, leveling hills, diverting rivers, and destroying vast swaths of pristine rainforest and productive cocoa farms, the other pillar of Ghana's economy. The rivers themselves, the sacred sources of life like the Pra, the Ankabra, and the Tano, were transformed into churning, toxic brown torrents, their beds dredged and their waters laced with a deadly cocktail of mercury, cyanide, and silt. The water, once used for drinking, fishing, and farming, became a source of disease, its aquatic life decimated. This mechanization turned the Galamsey trade into a highly lucrative, multi-billion-dollar shadow industry, creating complex chains of patronage that allegedly reached into the highest levels of political and traditional authority, making it incredibly difficult to police. The social consequences were just as severe. The influx of money and transient populations into rural communities brought with it a rise in crime, prostitution, and social conflict. Pitched battles would erupt between rival Galamsey groups or between miners and local farmers whose land had been destroyed. The very soul of the Earth Mother, Ashanti, was being violated for profit, a profound sacrilege that was now visible as a poisoned and scarred landscape from the sky. For successive Ghanaian governments, Galamsey became the nation's most intractable problem, a wicked problem that defied easy solutions. On one hand, it was an undeniable environmental and social menace that threatened the country's water supply, its food security, and the rule of law. On the other, it provided a direct livelihood for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of citizens who had been failed by the formal economy. To simply ban it was to risk pushing a huge, desperate population into even deeper poverty, potentially sparking widespread social unrest. The government responded with a cycle of crackdowns and amnesties. Heavily armed military police task forces, such as the famous Operation Vanguard, were deployed to raid illegal mining sites, seize excavators, and make arrests. These operations often had a temporary effect, but the miners would simply melt back into the forest, only to return once the patrols had left. The fight was asymmetric and impossible to win through force alone. As for every miner arrested, there were a dozen more willing to take the risk. This struggle represented a tragic new chapter in the nation's relationship with gold. The divine gift that had mythically originated from the Creator, the treasure that had built the magnificent Ashanti Empire, the resource that had financed independence, had now become a source of poison, division, and destruction. The legacy of Ashanti gold had devolved into a desperate, chaotic war waged by the nation's own people against their own land. Modern multinational mining. While the chaotic, small-scale war of the Galamsey raged across the countryside, a parallel and equally consequential revolution was taking place in the boardrooms and financial centers of the global north, one that would once again transform the formal gold sector and reestablish Ghana as a giant on the world stage, albeit on starkly different terms than ever before. The spectacular failure of the state-run mining corporations in the 1970s and early 1980s had left Ghana's economy in a state of near-total collapse. Faced with crippling debt and hyperinflation, the military government of Jerry Rawlings was forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which prescribed a bitter pill of economic medicine known as the Structural Adjustment Program, SAP. A core condition of these reforms was the wholesale liberalization of the economy and the aggressive courting of foreign direct investment. The mining sector was identified as the key to salvation. In 1986, the government enacted a new minerals and mining law, a piece of legislation that represented a complete reversal of Nkrumah's nationalist policies. This new legal framework was one of the most attractive to foreign investors anywhere in the world, offering generous tax holidays, drastically reduced royalty rates as low as 3%, guaranteed repatriation of profits, and security of tenure over vast land concessions. It was a deliberate, calculated opening of the floodgates, a signal to the global mining industry that the Gold Coast was, once again, open for business, and this time, the terms were exceedingly favorable. The state was effectively stepping back, admitting its failure to manage the resource, and handing the keys to the treasure house over to the only entities with the capital and technology to exploit it on a massive scale: the multinational mining corporations. The response was immediate and overwhelming, ushering in a new gold rush, this time of corporate giants, global players from South Africa, Canada, Australia, and the United States, such as Anglo Gold, which would merge with the privatized Ashanti Goldfields Corporation to become Anglo Gold Ashanti. Goldfields and Newmont poured billions of dollars into the country. But they did not come to simply reopen the old, decaying deep shafts of the past. They brought with them a new, brutally efficient, and landscape-altering technology: large-scale surface open-pit mining. This method represented a fundamental shift in the human relationship with the earth. Instead of surgically following veins deep underground, open-pit mining involved the wholesale removal of the entire surface of the earth, forest, topsoil, and rock, to get at the low-grade, microscopic gold deposits scattered throughout. Enormous excavators and haul trucks, some as large as a house, were deployed to blast and move millions of tons of rock, creating vast, terrace craters that were visible from space. The ore was then piled into massive heap leach pads, some covering hundreds of acres, where a dilute cyanide solution was dripped through the rock for months to dissolve the gold, which was then collected and processed. This was industrial extraction on an unimaginable scale, a method so capital-intensive and technologically advanced that it was entirely beyond the capacity of the old state corporation, and it sent Ghana's official gold production soaring to record levels, eventually making the nation the largest gold producer in all of Africa. This corporate-led renaissance of the formal mining sector created a new and deeply complex reality for Ghana, a reality of stark dualities. On the one hand, the industry was a resounding success in the eyes of the global market and the Ghanaian government's finance ministry. Gold once again became the nation's single largest source of foreign exchange, a critical pillar that stabilized the national currency and funded the national budget through royalties and corporate taxes. The new mines created thousands of direct, high-skilled jobs and spurred the growth of secondary industries, providing services and supplies. However, this success came at a steep price. The immense environmental footprint of open-pit mining led to widespread deforestation and the permanent alteration of landscapes. The use of cyanide, while regulated, created the constant risk of catastrophic spills that could poison entire river systems, leading to fierce opposition from environmental groups and local communities. A profound social dislocation also occurred. Entire villages were often relocated to make way for the expanding mines, with bitter and protracted disputes over the fairness of compensation for lost farmland and ancestral homes. This created a tense enclave economy where the highly paid mine employees and expatriate managers lived in well-serviced, fortified compounds, starkly contrasted with the poverty of the surrounding host communities who felt they bore the environmental costs of the mining without reaping its economic benefits. This modern era of multinational mining thus represents the latest, most globalized chapter in the legacy of Ashanti gold. It has revived the nation's economic fortunes, but it has also reignited the fundamental, centuries-old questions of sovereignty and equity. In this high-stakes, high-tech world, who truly owns the gold, and for whose ultimate benefit is it being torn from the sacred earth? Gold in contemporary fashion. While the earth-shattering machinery of multinational corporations and the desperate, river-churning excavators of the Galamsey represent the modern face of gold extraction, the enduring soul of Ashanti gold continues to express itself not in the language of stock prices and tonnage, but in the shimmering, silent vocabulary of personal adornment and high fashion. Long removed from its ancient role as currency for daily transactions, gold has in contemporary Ghana re-established its primary identity as the ultimate symbol of prestige, celebration, and deeply rooted cultural identity. It is the thread that connects the modern Ghanaian to the grand spectacles of the 17th century Ashanti court, a tangible piece of history worn on the body. This is nowhere more visible than at life's most significant social gatherings, weddings, funerals, naming ceremonies, and major festivals. At these events, gold is not merely an accessory. It is a critical component of the sartorial narrative, a radiant declaration of family status, personal success, and unwavering respect for tradition. For a traditional wedding or engagement ceremony, the bride and groom are often adorned in a breathtaking array of Kent cloth and gold jewelry, their appearance echoing the royal splendor of an Asantehene and his queen mother. The bride's ensemble can include intricate, handcrafted gold necklaces, elaborate bracelets stacked high on her wrists, dazzling earrings, and even delicate golden ornaments woven into her hair. These pieces are often not new purchases, but cherished family heirlooms, passed down through generations, each one imbued with the stories and spiritual presence of the ancestors who wore them before. The sheer weight and volume of the gold worn is a public testament to the wealth and standing of the two families being joined, a powerful, non-verbal statement of their history and their future prospects. The craftsmanship behind this contemporary jewelry continues to draw heavily from the deep well of Ashanti tradition, even as it adapts to modern tastes. The lost wax casting technique, the same Ciré-Purdue method perfected by the royal artisans centuries ago, is still the hallmark of the finest Ghanaian goldsmiths, many of whom can be found in the bustling workshops of Accra and Kumasi. They continue to create pieces based on the traditional lexicon of Adinkra symbols and proverbial motifs, the Gainayam, except for God, the Sankofa bird, and the crocodile Denkium, ensuring that the jewelry is not just beautiful, but also rich with philosophical meaning. However, modern Ghanaian designers are also forging a new path, creating a vibrant fusion of tradition and global contemporary style. They are reimagining the classic motifs, simplifying their forms, and incorporating them into more minimalist or avant-garde designs that appeal to a younger, more cosmopolitan generation. This new wave of designers is gaining international recognition, their gold creations appearing on runways in London, Paris, and New York, serving as a powerful cultural export that showcases Ghana's unique aesthetic heritage to the world. They are proving that the legacy of Ashanti gold is not a static relic of the past, but a dynamic, living tradition capable of constant reinvention. This fusion is also evident in the materials used. While 22 or 24 karat gold remains the ideal for its deep, rich color and cultural purity, designers are also working with lower carats and gold plating to make the iconic styles more accessible to a wider audience, democratizing the ability to participate in this powerful cultural expression. This cultural significance extends even to the most solemn of occasions, the funeral. In Akan tradition, a funeral is not just a moment of mourning, but a celebration of a life completed and a transition to the realm of the ancestors. As such, it is an event of great social importance, and gold plays a crucial role. Mourners, particularly close family members, will often wear their finest Kent in gold, a sign of respect for the deceased and a statement of the family's enduring strength and dignity, even in grief. In ancient times, high-ranking individuals were buried with gold dust and significant pieces of jewelry to ensure their status and comfort in the afterlife. While this practice is less common today, the symbolic association remains powerful. The gold worn at a funeral is a final tribute, a way of honoring the deceased's life and legacy with the most precious and incorruptible substance known. Thus, from the joyous celebrations of marriage to the profound rites of passage at death, gold remains the essential, luminous thread in the fabric of modern Ghanaian life. It is a language of beauty, wealth, and identity that has endured through empires, colonization, and economic turmoil. It is the visible soul of the nation, a personal connection for every wearer to the deep, golden river of their shared history. Gold and cultural rites. Beyond the dazzling public displays at weddings and festivals, gold retains its deepest, most resonant power within the sacred, often unseen, rituals that punctuate the cycle of life and death, and uphold the spiritual and political order of Akan society. It is in these moments, away from the gaze of the everyday world, that the metal transcends its function as mere adornment or symbol of wealth and reassumes its ancient role as a conduit to the divine, a substance capable of sanctifying relationships and connecting the living to the realm of the ancestors. Gold's role is not merely decorative, it is performative and sacramental. Its presence is essential for the completion and validation of key rites of passage, acting as a divine seal that confirms the legitimacy of the proceedings in the eyes of both the community and the spirits. This ritual function begins at birth. In a traditional Akan naming ceremony, known as Kwadzimo, a small particle of gold dust might be touched to the infant's lips, or a tiny gold trinket presented as a first gift. This act is laden with meaning. It is a prayer for a prosperous and valuable life for the child, a life as pure and incorruptible as the metal itself. It is a welcome into a community whose very identity is forged in gold, and it serves as the first, gentle binding of the new soul to the traditions and legacy of its people. This initial contact with the sacred metal is meant to bestow a measure of its spiritual protection and its inherent Ra, or life force, upon the child as they begin their earthly journey. The most profound ritual significance of gold, however, is manifested in the complex and sacrosanct processes of installment and distillment of a chief or king, a direct echo of the foundational act that brought the golden stool into being. When a new chief is chosen, his transition from a mortal man to the sacred occupant of a stool, the physical symbol of his lineage and authority, is managed through a series of private and public rituals saturated with gold. During the seclusion period, before he is presented to the people, he is ritually cleansed and consecrated. As part of this process, he is adorned with specific pieces of stool regalia, ancient gold jewelry that has been worn by his predecessors. This is not a matter of simply dressing up, it is an act of spiritual transference. By wearing the ancestral gold, he is believed to be absorbing the wisdom, strength, and accumulated experience of all the chiefs who came before him. The gold acts as a physical medium for the continuity of power. The climax of the public ceremony, the moment he is lowered and raised over the stool 3 times, is a spectacle of golden splendor. He is covered in the heaviest and most potent pieces of the treasury, his very body transformed into a living testament to the wealth and history of his state. Conversely, in the rare and serious event of a destolment, the process is reversed. The disgraced chief is publicly stripped of his golden regalia, his sandals, his rings, his necklaces, and his can cloth. This ritualistic removal of gold is a powerful and humiliating act, symbolizing the complete revocation of his authority and the severing of his connection to the ancestral spirits. He reverts to being an ordinary man precisely at the moment the sacred gold is taken from him. This deep connection extends to the spiritual world through the linguist, or okiami, and his iconic, gold-covered staff of office. The linguist is the chief's most important advisor and the intermediary between the ruler and the people, and even between the physical and spiritual worlds. His staff, the okiami poma, is a wooden staff whose finial is carved into a proverbial symbol and then meticulously covered in gold leaf. When the linguist speaks, he holds the staff, and it is understood that his words are not his own, but the wisdom of the chief, sanctioned by the authority of the stool and the ancestors. The gold on the staff acts as a spiritual insulator and amplifier. It purifies the words that are spoken, ensuring they are weighty and true, and it reflects the sacred light of the chief's authority to all who are listening. The staff itself is a ritual object, and its presence is required for the chief's pronouncements to have legal and spiritual validity. It is the visible proof that the channel between the ruler and the ruled is open and functioning under divine sanction. Through these rites, from the first taste of life to the solemnity of royal succession and the daily exercise of power, gold is not just present, it is an active participant. Is a non-human agent in the drama of Akan life, a sacred substance that validates, consecrates, and communicates with a power that no spoken word alone can achieve, ensuring the unbreakable bond between the past and the present, the living and the dead, remains ever luminous and strong. The unbreakable bond with gold. From the primordial whispers of myth, where it was born as the solidified soul of the sun, to the roar of colossal earth movers carving craters into the modern landscape, gold has remained the central, immutable element in the Epic of Ghana. It is less a resource the nation possesses and more the fundamental code of its DNA. A shimmering, double-edged helix of prosperity and peril, sovereignty and subjugation, unity and discord. Its story is the nation's story. The journey through time has revealed a substance with an almost alchemical power to transform society, building as surely as it destroys. It was the divine rationale that coalesced kinship groups into the first Akan states, the economic engine that powered their expansion, and the spiritual anchor that, in the form of the Sika DWA Kofi, fused a confederation of warring chiefs into the mighty Ashanti Empire, one of Africa's most complex and powerful pre-colonial states. This legacy of indigenous achievement, of an empire literally built from gold, forged an unbreakable link between the metal and the very concept of a sovereign, successful African polity. It became the ultimate symbol of what was possible, a golden refutation of the colonialist narratives of a continent without history. Yet this very brilliance was the lure that drew the European ships to the coast, turning the source of the nation's strength into the object of another empire's avarice. The same gold that financed the magnificent courts of Kumasi was melted down to fuel the imperial ambitions of Great Britain, its sacred identity scrubbed away in the ledgers of the London bullion market. The Anglo-Ashanti Wars were not fought over territory alone. They were a brutal, century-long struggle for the nation's soul, a conflict crystallized in the British obsession with capturing a golden stool whose significance they could never truly comprehend. This tormented relationship continued into the post-colonial era, embodying the nation's highest hopes and its most bitter disappointments. In the euphoric dawn of independence, the leaders of the new Ghana sought to reclaim this birthright, turning the outward flow of colonial extraction inward to fund the dream of a modern, self-sufficient nation. For a fleeting moment, gold was once again the builder, the financier of dams, universities, and a pan-African vision. But this dream corroded, and the failure of state-run mining mirrored a broader national malaise, proving that ownership without stewardship was a hollow victory. The decay of the formal sector birthed the chaotic, destructive energy of the Galamsey, a desperate war waged by the poor against their own land, poisoning the sacred rivers in a frantic search for the very substance that was once believed to purify life. This modern paradox is the essence of Ghana's unbreakable bond with gold. The nation is now Africa's largest producer, a titan of the global industry, its landscape dominated by the hyper-efficient, scientifically precise open pits of multinational corporations, yet it is simultaneously ravaged by the unregulated anarchy of informal mining. The gold blesses the national budget with foreign exchange while cursing the local communities with polluted water and displaced lives. It is a source of immense national pride and a cause of profound national anxiety. This enduring duality reveals that gold is more than an economic asset. It is a moral and spiritual inheritance that forces a constant, often painful, national self-examination. To be Ghanaian is to be in a perpetual dialogue with this legacy. It is to see the intricate gold weights of the ancestors and recognize a heritage of sophisticated commerce and philosophy. It is to witness the Ashanti adorned in full regalia and feel a direct connection to an unbroken history of power and cultural brilliance. It is to wear a piece of gold jewelry at a wedding and participate personally in this centuries-old language of beauty and prestige. But it is also to look upon a brown, silted river and feel the pang of loss, to see the headlines about Galamsey-related tragedies and understand the social cost of desperation, and to grapple with the complex questions of equity and environmental justice posed by the massive corporate mines. The bond is unbreakable because gold is embedded in every facet of the national identity, in its sacred origins, its imperial glory, its colonial wounds, its post-colonial ambitions, and its present-day contradictions. The story of Ashanti gold is therefore not a closed chapter of history, but a living, evolving narrative. The future of Ghana is inextricably bound to how it chooses to manage this precious, potent, and perilous inheritance. The challenge remains what it has always been: how to harness the immense material power of this sacred metal without losing the nation's soul in the process, a question that every generation must answer anew as they continue to draw their identity from the rich, troubled, and ever-shining earth. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. The story of Ashanti gold is the story of Ghana itself. If you found this narrative captivating, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Your support helps us tell these vital stories.